Welcome to episode 39 of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. This month I had the honor to speak to Dr. Lwazi Lushaba. Dr. Lushaba is a professor of political science at the University of Cape Town, an author, and a revolutionary intellectual. He is author of the book Development as Modernity, Modernity as Development, and editor of From National Liberation to Democratic Renaissance in Southern Africa. In this episode, Dr. Lushaba discusses South Africa, apartheid, appropriating decolonization, solidarity, confronting colonialism, autonomy of thought, language and thought, limits of Marxism, time and colonialism, and genocide. Thank you to Awareness for the Music, and here's a brief jingle from a fellow Channel Zero Network podcast.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero Network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
Yeah, let's get on with it, Chris.
All right, so Dr. Lushaba, to begin, I was wondering if you could give a transformational moment in your youth when you saw through the hegemony of colonial domination and started thinking critically about society. This may not be a single event, but a series of moments.
I like the fact that you recognize that this couldn't be just a singular event. It couldn't happen just as a result of one occurrence. It takes long for consciousness to realize that there is something wrong with society. It is not very often, that we suddenly, because of one event, realize that structurally, historically, socially, there is something out of joint with society. And so I was born in South Africa, in the 1970s. So it was in those tumultuous years, that I came into the world when, the 1970s in South Africa, for those who may not be familiar, were the years when, a number of events had occurred. So apartheid is very much in its, full steam, but it is beginning to be challenged from, realms that it hadn't expected. There is a rise in the trade union movement in South Africa, which hadn't been allowed previously. But there is also a new movement called the Black Consciousness Movement, led by Biko, which started in 1969. By the 1970s, it had gained full steam. It was beginning to be felt. Its impact was beginning to be felt, in schools, in the communities, and in the broader society at large. And here was the important thing about the Black Consciousness Movement. Even though it did not have, the large following in terms of personnel, its ideas were very transformative. It attended, into, the intellectual, foundations of apartheid. And it broke those intellectual foundations, and so the influence that Black Consciousness Movement had is to be weighed not on the basis of the number of those who proclaimed to espouse its ideas, but, in how it managed to raise that level of consciousness. So I was born in that decade. And of course, I would come into my own political consciousness in the 1980s, and those with whom I came into political consciousness and became active, we thought of ourselves and we continue to think of ourselves as, the Winnie Mandela generation. These were the years when, basically the most prominent political figure, whose example, we looked up to was Winnie Mandela. And so the enigmatic, figure of Winnie Mandela was the political subject, was for us the exemplar political subject, that we looked up to. And of course, going to school in the 1980s, being of Winnie Mandela's generation also meant that we saw and, it registered in our minds that we went through The 1980s in South Africa were basically one state of emergency after the other. Now, the state of emergency in South Africa under colonialism was basically when, the apartheid regime, or the white settler colonial regime, more appropriately, suspended the law. And basically, you had civil liberties and all, even the few liberties that we have, very few, were suspended. So there would be a curfew, you are not to be found outside. You could be jailed without trial. It was basically the suspension of any idea, of law when you're dealing with the Black colonized, So in the 1980s, we lived from one, state of emergency to the other. And I was conscious of the fact that from time to time, school suddenly came to an abrupt halt for us. It would be suspended, there would be boycotts, and so it was this holistic political environment, but majorly at the level of thought, when I began to think more closely and seriously about colonialism, it was when I went to the university, and I went to a historically Black university, called the University of Transkei. Now, we call them historically Black universities in South Africa, but that doesn't quite reveal everything about them. It is that in South Africa, under the white settler colonial regime, you had universities for white people, you had universities for Black people, but universities for Black people were further disaggregated into ethnic universities. And so it depended, which ethnic group you belonged to. If you were a Zulu person, a Zulu-speaking person, there was a university for Zulu, for the Zulu ethnic group. If you were a Venda-speaking person, there was a university. So there was a further divide and rule, even, at the level of, university training. So I went to a historically Black universities, but I somewhat breached the apartheid intentions, because even though I am a Zulu-speaking person, I went into, a university belonging to a different ethnic group. So I somewhat broke those ethnic boundaries. But this was a university unintended by the apartheid regime, because it gave us an example of something they hadn't thought. When I went to the university, I found Black professors in all the fields of study, ranging from medicine, to anthropology, to politics. And so for a moment I was, why did colonialism suppose that we are a people devoid of thought, when here we were with very distinguished professors in every field who held a university and were very productive in thought? But you had, on the other hand, an apartheid, or rather a white settler colonial stereotype that were a people who were incapable of thought. But I saw with my own eyes, professors who trained me, who were brilliant, in all the fields of study. And so I began to think, maybe colonialism and its contradictions is something that is to be studied closely. But I couldn't, of course, have done that on my own without the guidance of, a mentor, who took me after, who took me under his wing. So I had a Nigerian, professor of political science, brilliant Nigerian professor of political science, who taught me at first year, Professor Igosa Osagai, wrote an important text, titled The Crippled Giant, which is the political history of Nigeria. And so, because now this is the importance of it. He came from Nigeria. This is the early 90s in South Africa. Nigeria had been independent since 1963. He comes to South Africa. It's a society that is just gaining its independence in 1994. In fact, he came prior to South Africa gaining its independence. So he's acutely aware of the challenge that South Africa is going to face at the level of thought, which is to produce its own intellectuals that are going to think about society and going to think about colonialism in order to undo it. And so this is how I became somewhat a beneficiary of that consciousness on his part, and subsequently on the part of many other African scholars who took me under their wing and trained me such that I could understand colonialism, and in that way would be able to challenge, the intellectual basis of our domination by the white settler minority in South Africa. And so post, my training at the University of Transkei under Professor Igosa Osagai, I would then go on to train in Nigeria. And it is from there that I would come under the wing of virtually the first generation of, post-colonial African scholars, people like Mahmoud Mamdani, Den Nabudere, and many others who took a keen interest in my intellectual development.
Thank you for sharing that story so much, Dr. Lushaba. I think what you went into really draws into it's actually my third question. And this is about the term decolonizing. And when I spoke to Dr. Lewis Gordon, he said that the term decolonize even needs to be decolonized now. And you have also mentioned how this is a term that has, in some instances, become a marketed term instead of back to its true term or larger term of what it should be. And in a lecture you gave, you explained that societies who were successful in decolonizing thought didn't do it on an individual level or based on liberal meritocracy. You explained that it was done with communities of scholarship, which is what you had just mentioned. And the example of Nigeria with the School of Social History, is that?
Yes, the Ibadan School of Social History is.
And I was wondering if you could speak more on this concept of what decolonizing thought is, and then more on these experiences which you just kind of went into.
So let me begin somewhat in the reverse and, in trying to attend to the riddle you've posed. One of the major problems we have today is that decolonization, other people have styled it into decoloniality. It's a school of thought that largely comes out of Latin America, the decolonial school, closely associated with people like, Maldonado Torres, people like Walter Mignolo, and several other Latin American scholars. Of course, many of them are now based in America, Now, there are two things that have happened with these terms, decolonization and decoloniality. It is that the liberal establishment, the liberal university itself, has done very well in appropriating these concepts, such that there is a very odd phenomenon where even those, who speak in the name of decolonizing the university and of decolonizing society, today are weighed for institutional validation and affirmation by the very institutions that we supposedly need to decolonize. Now, to be more precise, you have an odd situation in South Africa where we're struggling to decolonize the universities, just like we're struggling to decolonize society. But the very academics who write and speak about decolonizing the university are the first to actually seek institutional validation and, institutional affirmation in different ways. So they continue with the same old colonial practices, that the university uses in order to bestow onto others, that affirmation and withdraw it or withhold it unto others, And of course, the university puts it, in very liberal terms. It is those who have fulfilled the requirements of publishing and whatnot. But we also know that, once you get into that psyche, what kind of work gets published, and therefore the whole establishment then takes hold of the narrative. So we are now at a point in decolonization where this discourse has been thoroughly appropriated by the institutions. The institutions, not only in the South or in South Africa, you see this in America, you see this, throughout the world. Now, funding agencies now give grants. You have imperial organizations that now give grants, to scholars who are working on decolonization. Now, it has to be a contradiction when you have to depend on Ford Foundation money to decolonize society, when you have to depend on, the very imperialist, funds in order to decolonize society. But also within the countries or within society, you find in South Africa a similar situation where the most reactionary institutions, but because they have more resources, are the ones that attract more scholars working on decolonization because they have more money, to give to these, to these scholars. And so you have scholars who speak and write in the name of decolonization, but they have a reactionary political outlook. They have a very anti-society, intellectual outlook. And so because now decolonization has been thoroughly divorced from a concern for society. So you have academics, like I say, who work and write in the name of decolonization, but they have no organic linkage with the struggles in society at large. So decolonization has become an elitist mode, basically, of upward, social mobility within the academy itself. So I suppose that, when, Gordon Lewis says the concept itself is in need of decolonizing, it is because, in part, the liberal journals, the liberal publishing houses, the liberal institutions, the liberal funding, agencies have all appropriated. You now have, journal issues that are journal issues by journals that have been known to have a very liberal, outlook, now welcoming articles on decolonization. And of course, you have a flurry of scholars who say they are working on decolonization going to publish there because, of course, all they are looking for, it's the brown points that will enable them rise through the university. Now, how do you decolonize that kind of an institution? That's one quandary that we find ourselves in relation to the concept. Now, to trace my step back to, the point you're making about to decolonize, the university and society cannot be an individual, endeavor. Now, this is the reason, the reasoning behind such a claim. When colonialism comes, especially, and here we have to distinguish between two forms of colonialism. Now, if looked at very closely, colonialism took two forms, and this is across the world. It is either that you had what we call colonies of domination, basically where you had a few colonial administrators who at the moment of independence simply packed their bags and left. Now, the contradictions in those societies are different from settler colonies. Settler colonies are places like America, like South Africa, like Mozambique and Angola, where the white settlers settled in large numbers in these societies and turned the colony into their homes. The contradictions in these societies are different from the contradictions in colonies of domination. Now, if we're conscious of that fact, it would mean then that we first have to say, what is the nature of a colonial society? And the nature of a colonial society would be different in a settler colonial society than it would be in a colony of domination. But there is something that runs across the two forms of colonialism, which is that colonialism is based on a supposition, a number of suppositions, one of which is that the white person is superior over the black colonized or the non-Western. And this superiority is largely based on the fact that black people are incapable of thought. And so colonialism styles itself as a gift to us. It is a gift to the colonized in the sense that it brings unto us enlightenment. And so it comes with a whole package of thought called enlightenment thought or post-enlightenment thought. So if you think of all the disciplines that come to us, as a result of colonialism, these are all a function or a product of post-enlightenment thought. Now, the frontal attack of this kind of thought is not directed at individual people. So colonialism does not come and say, Lwazi Lushaba, we are going to colonize you and this is how we are going to think. And we are going to do so to you because you are Lwazi Lushaba. We just don't like your configuration. No. Colonialism decides. The logic of colonialism is that there are a people, and who are these people? It is Black people in their totality. So it's a totalizing system. It does not offer one an option to opt in or opt out. I can't raise my hand and say, can I be excused from the effects of colonialism, or I choose to opt in? No, it's a totalizing effect. It's a frontal attack that does not leave people with, a choice to opt in or opt out. That is why, the Nigerian sociologist called Peter Eke calls it a supra-individual social movement whose after effects far outlive the time and space of its occurrence. So, colonialism affected all of us as Black people. And so to undo it, it means that it has to be undone precisely as a collective endeavor because it affected all of us. Now, at the level of thought, it means that post-independence, all colonial societies had to attack this post-Enlightenment thought, that was founded on reason and rationality from the West. And so you couldn't possibly, it doesn't matter how bright you are, you couldn't possibly as an individual scholar, an individual sociologist, an individual, oncologist, individually say that you were going to take on this whole body of thought that came, out of post-Enlightenment, movement. So what was needed? There were a number of things needed, two of which I'm going to highlight. One was you needed to first build in large numbers a cadre of indigenous African scholars. You needed to first have in large numbers this cadre of committed indigenous African scholars. Now, when I say committed, it is not just an abstract concept. So my point is that two things needed to happen at the attainment of independence in order to decolonize thought and to decolonize society. First, you needed to produce your own intellectuals as a colonized society and to produce them in large numbers because you needed a mass of intellectuals who would be able to confront colonial thought. It couldn't be confronted by individuals. And so you needed a cohort of indigenous, African scholars who would be able to do that. And to produce that fell on the first generation of African scholars. That task fell on the first generation of African scholars. And indeed, we owe it to that generation of African scholars for showing us a commitment to society. And now I need to explain what I mean when they say, and I say, these were committed African scholars. Now, these were people who inherited universities all through the continent post-1960. They inherited the universities from white colonial, academics. And so they were the inaugural, so to say, indigenous professoriate. And the university needed to massify precisely at that moment. It needed to cease to be this elitist and exclusive, institution that took very few people and a large number of the children of the colonial administrators. So classes were massified. Now, what it meant is that this generation had to postpone its own individual upward mobility in the hierarchy. They had to be less concerned about, acquiring as many publications as possible in order to be able to become professors immediately, because they needed to spend more time in the classroom. They needed to spend more time with their postgrad students in order to produce a cohort of postgrad, students who would be able to rise, to the occasion of taking over the academy. And many of them, indeed, I myself having benefited, from them, many of them tell us of the first 20 years, in most instances of their academic career, not focused on themselves, but focused on producing, a large number of intellectuals, indigenous scholars in their own societies. And they postponed their own, as I've said, academic upward mobility. It is this generation that we owe, gratitude to, for creating an example of these academic communities that were needed in order to be able to produce academics, in large numbers. Because to produce academics in large numbers, the indigenous cadre, of academics in large numbers did not mean just graduating people with degrees. It meant that you had to train them in a certain kind of perspective that would equip them to confront colonial thought. And so this couldn't be done in a typical liberal fashion where, just students come in, they become postgrad students and they go through. No. They needed to be initiated into communities of scholarship. And indeed, there are two examples within the continent, of such communities of scholarship that I think are worth, mentioning. One was based at the University of Ibadan, where I studied. It started way before I got to the University of Ibadan. This was called the Ibadan School of Social History. Its leading lights were people like Ade Ajayi, Alan Ogod, and Kenneth Dige, and many others. Now, what was the distinguishing mark of the Ibadan School of Social History? Its concern was to undo the supposition legitimated by social anthropology or colonial anthropology, which was that basically prior to colonialism, prior to effective colonization, Africa had no history. It was the land enveloped in the long, dark night, of barbarism. What the Ibadan School of History did was to go behind colonialism and to write the history, the long history of African communities prior to colonialism, to show that historical movement is not an exclusive preserve of European people. Historical movement exists anywhere where human beings are to be found. And so the Ibadan School of Social History engaged in this important task of rewriting, African history prior to colonialism. But there was an experiment going on also as the Ibadan School of History engaged in that, which was it took postgrad students, masters and PhD students, who also engaged in that kind of research, that showed or proved that Africa had a history prior to colonialism. And once it did that, what happened was that after finishing their dissertations, these students had, the senior academics working with them in order to have their dissertations published as books. Now, what did this lead to? There was a burgeoning literature, produced by indigenous academics. The other example, of course, is the Dar es Salaam School of Radical Political Economy. Now, as the name itself suggests, this was, a school founded on the supposition that colonialism had been motivated to the last instance by economic effects. And so this school basically adopted, the Latin American developed dependency approach. Now, in Latin America, precisely at the time when the Dar es Salaam School was coming up, there was the Andre Gunda Frank-led, development and underdevelopment school of radical political economy. Now, the Dar es Salaam school was basically focused on the economic effects or after effects of colonialism. And so for them, the problem was neo-colonialism, the continuation of the same, colonially engineered economic relations between Africa and the West. Of course, as Mamdani, one of the leading members, of the Dar es Salaam school, of course, by the 1980s, the Dar es Salaam school had come to realize that the problem of colonialism exceeded the economic motivations. They had come to realize that, their exclusive focus on the economy and on class, particularly on class categories, was not able to explain violence, for instance, when violence was not based on market-based categories, or when violence did not erupt between classes, but erupted between different ethnic groups. Class analysis was not able to explain this kind of conflict. And so they came to realize that actually, the Latin American developed dependency school was useful, but it had imposed upon them basically a closure of the dialectic. It had led to them basically coming to think about colonialism in a singular form, or unidirectional manner, and so they had to rethink. But its success again was to produce in large numbers again the indigenous African intellectuals. And so it showed us the example of how to confront Western thought, by building communities, of scholarship. Again, I was a beneficiary, of the Dar es Salaam school, even though by the time I went to the university, it had long disintegrated, but its members continued, to function within the African community of scholars, and they continued to take a keen interest on developing, the next generations of African scholars. And so now I am going to stop at the return of the decoloniality perspective into the African discourse on decolonization. Its entry, which is fairly recent, in the past 5 to 10 years, into the African discourse on decolonization, is similar to the entry of the dependency school into African radical political economy. And its effects have already shown themselves to be the same effects that, the dependency school had on the thinking of, Marxist scholars within the continent. And what was the effect? So the dependency school said, the problem with colonialism is economy. It creates, an asymmetry in the relations between Western economies and, peripheral economies, or African economies specifically. And once you focus on studying and understanding this relationship, you would be able to breach, the problems of colonialism. But as I said, they then forgot about everything else. These scholars, basically became singular, or unidirectional in their thinking about colonialism. And so they forgot basically to say, what is the concrete situation on the ground? Can we look at what is happening on the ground? And out of that, fashion concepts and categories that will enable us make sense of the actually existing politics in our society. No, all they were concerned with, we already have the tools with which to understand what is happening. Now, what you had is that what was happening had to fit into their pre-existing or preconceived categories. It's the same thing with the decoloniality perspective that came out of the actually existing conditions in Latin America. But what it then does when it comes into the continent is that it basically denies the possibility for really autochthonous thought autonomous thought that looks at the concrete situation, because all you had in the past 5-10 years, especially in South Africa, where the decoloniality perspective, had a much more stronger sway than in the rest of the continent. You had people basically mimicking Maldonado Torres, mimicking, Walter Mignolo, mimicking, everything that came out of the decoloniality school, in Latin America. And in the process, they closed their eyes on the concrete. What was the concrete, situation that needed resolution? What were the concrete contradictions in society that needed resolution? If they had done so, one of the things that would have become obvious is that South Africa is a settler colonial society. And so, much more than systems, it is the interpersonal relations between the white settler and the black colonized that matters. But they missed it because the focus, again, or the concepts and the categories with which they were working were borrowed from the decoloniality perspective. So they became obsessed, with notions of being, and very abstract concepts that actually did little to illuminate the reality of the everyday relations between a white settler colonizer in South Africa and the black colonized.
Thank you, Dr. Lushaba, for breaking that down amazingly and sharing those stories. There is so much to comment on what you just said. For one, I think really what you're talking about of the solidarity and the mutualism of how you were taught, and the way that this education of solidarity you were brought in. I think what is so important is that it is for one an act of love, because it helps future generations. It goes against the capitalist motives of individuality and production of self, and fighting against these journals that are behind a paywall, and self-publishing not only indigenous scholars, but making one's own knowledge from their communities is so important in these lessons. And also a point you have brought up before is the importance of language as used as a force of resistance and struggle, and language revitalization, I think, was another very powerful point you've made in other lectures. And I believe you're on a radio show and you were questioned about decolonizing healthcare. And you brought up this amazing point on if doctors knew the indigenous language. I believe the example you were using was Zulu. These doctors would know the culture of disease between physical and ancestral worlds and disequilibriums. Another very powerful point.
Yeah, I may say something about that. You're quite right. Often enough, when we clamor for the decolonization of the education and the university and society, people in the natural sciences especially tend to think that the natural sciences are shielded from the imperative of decolonization. And so often enough, you would hear people say, so how do you decolonize mathematics? 1 + 1 is always 2. So what do you want to change there? Or people would say, how do you decolonize architecture? The formulas are always the same. You have, to delimit space in a certain way. I could talk about all of those, whether it's mathematics or whether it's architecture, but I want to focus on the medical sciences in relation to language, because one of the great gifts that we have had from that first generation of African intellectuals, I probably belong to the, 4th, 5th generation, of African scholars. But one of the greatest gifts we've had, from the first generation of African scholars is that voice, from the Kenyan scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who has argued consistently over decades about the need for us to develop our own languages. He's been, the most consistent voice and, has even experimented himself, writing in his own language. It is rather unfortunate that it's a movement that, has not been successful almost 60 years, after, or, how many decades since the attainment of independence. But that greatest gift to us, has taught us a number of lessons. The importance of language in the process of thought. Now, language often is presented to us, especially by people in the natural sciences, is often presented to us as if it was a vehicle, just but a vehicle, an instrument, that you use basically to communicate. Now, I could go into the linguistic theories of, language, but that's not what we need to make the point. What we need is to debunk the supposition, or to debunk the impression created by natural scientists that they use language in a manner that is neutral, so to say. It is nothing but an implement. It's more or less like a spoon that you use, to measure, medication, and you put it in your mouth. Language, one, we know that, as linguists tell us, languages do not divide the world in the same way. But we also know, even from the Western thinkers, including Michel Foucault, that the world is not an accomplice of our knowledge, but actually we use language to make sense of the world, to categorize things, to name things, to create a hierarchy amongst things. The hierarchy is not amongst the things themselves. The hierarchy is in language, and then we impose that hierarchy on the things. And so language is not just this neutral vehicle that we have access to equally if we speak the same language. Language, as we've said, languages do not divide the world in the same way. But more importantly, language is the key into accessing a people's mode of being in the world. You can't understand anything about a people if you don't understand their language. Because if you understand a people via a different language, what you already do is to impose onto those people categories that are drawn from that other language. Now, Western medicine is a very good example of it. Western medicine assumes, because of the Western culture, assumes that disease is nothing but a bodily affliction. Or at worst, if it's psychiatry, it assumes that it is nothing but a pathology or a neurosis that can be attended to, via the brain. And so when you don't speak indigenous African languages, especially in South Africa, whether it is isiXhosa, isiZulu, or Chivenda, Chitonga, and other languages, one of the things that remains close to you is the African cultural world and its idea or notion of disease and health. So what you do when you then come in the language of Western medicine is that you impose a Western notion or idea of disease and health onto a people who have a different understanding of disease and health. Because for African people, particularly AmaZulu and AmaXhosa in South Africa, disease is not just a bodily affliction. It is not something that you can cure by simply introducing chemicals and, manipulating the body via the medication. Disease oftentimes amongst Black people in South Africa is an indication of a disequilibrium between the physical world or the material world, which is where this body, exists, and the supernatural or the metaphysical, or more specifically, the ancestral. Once there is a disequilibrium between the ancestral or the metaphysical and the material world where the body lives, often that disequilibrium results in disease or manifests in disease. And to cure that disease, you see, the disease is not, it's a sign of something else. The disease is a sign of the disequilibrium. And so, to cure at a primary level, you have to restore that equilibrium between the ancestral world and the physical world where the body exists. Now, you then have a situation where people tell us, oh, medical doctors don't need to understand the language, of the people amongst whom they work, because in any case, all they need to understand is the language of Western medicine. And so in South Africa, you have a very odd situation where you have medical doctors who do not understand the cultural world of the people they cure, because they assume the universality of Western medicine. They assume that Western medicine is universal. It travels unencumbered into all cultural regions of the world. When it meets a disease in South Africa, it will cure it. When it meets a disease in Kenya, it will cure it. This is Western medicine, all-knowing Western medicine. But if these medical doctors understood the languages of our people, they would have known that at certain moments, they would have a pause and perhaps inquire into, may it not be the case that the disease that we see with the eye, the disease that we feel with the stethoscope, may it not be that it is a sign of something else, such that our labor to cure this is not going to lead to fruition because we have not attended to the primary cause. Now, how would the medical doctors have known this? They would have known this if they spoke the languages of the people amongst whom they work. But now you have the arrogance of the universality of Western medicine, that comes with also the arrogance of the language of the colonizer English, that supposes that these two travel the world unencumbered and can have access to all regions of life, without any limitation. And so we have lost a number, and we continue to lose a number of those who are good and dear to us, because time and again they return to the same doctor who changes the regime, but it doesn't help. But they persist. At no point do they say that maybe there is something we don't know. They would have known that had they learned the languages of our people, because language is not just a means of communication, it is the key to culture. It is the only way you can access the culture of a people.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Lushaba. When you were speaking of this, it made me think about your writings on autonomy of thought. And I believe you had quoted Foucault talking about the intellectual blackmail of the Enlightenment, fighting back against these years of philosophy that was used as global white supremacy, as well as how this was turned into science and just totally debunked science as well, that created these myths. And adding on to that, to quote you had written, Africa loses its autonomy. Nothing about it can be known except when juxtaposed with the West. Stripped of its history and autonomy, the continent becomes the other of the West, defined by what it lacks or what it is not. And with this fighting against the years of Enlightenment philosophy that propped up global white supremacy, and then went into what you would call debunked science as well, that like eugenics and all of the things that Herbert Spencer and others went into, that created these horrific, violent structures of colonialism and white supremacy, which you point out is where Marxism finds its limits, because it is not able to confront, as you say, apartheid or racial capitalism by seeing that there is class solidarity with white supremacy. And I'm speaking from the context of the U.S., especially of that, in that is where you see these walls that you hit quite quickly with Marxism, and the importance of what you're talking about, this autonomy of thought and looking beyond these structures to actual forms of liberation.
You're quite right. I mean, one of the things that happens, immediately one speaks of decolonizing society. One is often confronted, with, let's be blunt, very dishonest and disingenuous, response, which is, so if you don't want this kind of knowledge, what is your image of society? What would the university look like? It's more or less like saying, or if you don't have a ready model that will substitute for this, then leave us to continue with this model. It's some kind of bad faith, that accompanies, that kind of a question, which is, well, if you can't give me brick for brick, article for article, what would you substitute the Western pen with? What are you going to substitute everything with? If you can't give me article for article, brick for brick, then, go think about your model. Meanwhile, let us continue to think about, let us continue to use the existing model. You know what that is meant to do? That is meant to deny, to us precisely what you've rightly characterized as the autonomy of thought. It is a kind of supposition that, one, all societies develop in a unilinear fashion. They all began from the same position. They were pre-modern, they became modern, and they continue in that unilinear fashion. So more or less like, look, just get onto this movement, this teleological movement of all societies. There's no other way you can progress. The other supposition is that it supposes that Europe knew by the 16th century, even before the Industrial Revolution, what it was going to look like. It obviously did not know what it was going to look like, prior to that period. It is simply what it knew is that it did not like its existence in the medieval era. It did not like, what was the model of society in the medieval period, where there was the great chain of being, with the clergy and, the divine rulers, lording it over people. They wanted a different kind of society, and they allowed themselves the possibility, they believed in the possibility of them imagining a new society. That possibility is denied to us. It's as though you are taking society to the peril when you say we must imagine a new society. Now, this is a very fine-grained kind of oppression that is not easy to notice. You did not worry when Europe said, let us imagine a new society. But you worry when Africans say, let us imagine a new society. You accorded these ones that right to engage in experimentation in order to, bring into bear a new society. You are not about to countenance even a day of these other people, experimenting about what a new society may look like. Now, this is where Marxism and liberalism agree. Because despite what Marxists tell us about, Marxism's, concern with the history of societies, when it comes to, African societies, Marxism shares with liberalism the same supposition that all societies move through a unilinear pattern. They begin from being pre-modern. Marxists say pre-industrial. Liberals say pre-modern. Liberal sociologists say they become modern. Marxists say they become capitalist. Liberals say they become postmodern. Marxists say, well, they become either socialist or... But nonetheless, the point is that they all subscribe to this teleological movement of society, where societies progress. And this idea of progress is key, to both liberalism and Marxism, but also to Western thought generally, because the idea of progress is a supposition that every particular phenomenon moves through successive stages, wherein each successive stage represents an improvement on the previous one. So you more or less can plot a line and put, moments in that line. And each successive line represents an improvement on the previous one. This is the idea of modern thought, generally, of post-Enlightenment thought, generally. Every field of Western thought functions with this supposition. Give you an example. You go see a medical doctor today. The doctor already has a line, a scale for you. Chris is afflicted with this disease. I'm going to put Chris on this regime of treatment. After 2 weeks, I expect Chris to have moved from this to this, stage. And after 2 weeks to that stage. When I call Chris back for a review after 2 weeks, I expect him to have moved to this, level, to this moment, which would be an improvement. That's how Western thought generally functions. It assumes that, when you are a first-year student, you are at a lesser level, you become a second-year student. That's the succession. But we know that African societies, again, to return you to African cosmology, amongst AmaZulu and AmaXhosa, that's not how life is styled. When you live in the world, you are supposed to complete certain cycles in life. And so, which means that your life is not unilinear, but you have different cycles that shade into each other. This is a cycle of life in your youth, that you are supposed to complete, and you finish that cycle, you start another cycle of life, and this cycle shade into each other. That's how life is structured. We do not function with that unilinear notion of progress, because you may, for instance, in African cosmology, go to a traditional healer who tells you that, you are going to go through a bad spell, of disease, and it would appear like it's incurable. It's a cycle of life that you need to complete. And once you've completed that cycle of life, another cycle in your life will open. Now, why do I bring this? It is because we have been, as African people, at the receiving end, of overtly imperialist thought, which is, overtly imperialistic, justified colonialism. But even thought coming from the West that pretends or that hopes to be liberatory, like Marxism, without realizing it, it itself locks us into basically a situation where we are denied that autonomy of thought, as African people. That is why I am not very encouraged. Comparing thought is part of science. I mean, no one denies that we have to compare, and also we have to benefit from the solidarities that come from elsewhere. But that must not then become rob us of an opportunity or of our right to autonomy of thought. So that is why I've been a bit critical of the decoloniality school coming from Latin America via America into, South Africa and the continent, because it has done just that. But so that I don't digress. Now, if we recognize then that even thought that presupposes itself as liberatory, like Marxism, if that thought has a potential to rob us of our rights, to develop autonomous forms of cognizing, I think that intellectual blackmail you were talking about of enlightenment, has not to be looked at as just the blackmail of enlightenment thought that we think of as being liberal and usual. It is a blackmail that also extends, to radical Western thought. And so our reception of Western radical thought, has to be circumspect. It may be useful to a certain extent, but it is not a substitute for the analysis of the concrete.
Thank you, Dr. Lushaba. And if I think I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that with the Enlightenment, some forms of creolization of philosophy may be beneficial, but the foundation must be autonomy of thought. And what I'm thinking about is also in a lecture you had spoke about how anthropologists use time to deny humanness, and this reminds me of the colonization of Western thought by making time linear, and that going against the autonomy of different cultures for sure, and different struggles. Yeah. And just to add one more thing, I was wondering, when we're talking about countering Marxism or other thoughts, I was wondering, does anarchism fit into any of your studies or of things you've studied in Africa or South Africa? Because I see anarchism as a set of ideas that are based on, for one, breaking down hierarchies and also going against forms of domination, whether that would be patriarchy, colonialism, and white supremacy and other forms.
I must admit, I in my years as a graduate student of philosophy, I encountered anarchism, but I haven't quite, after then, read it as closely to be able to speak intelligibly about it. So even though it sounds enticing what you are saying about, the fact that it breaks down hierarchies, having studied Marxism, which, most people would, jump at a go and say it's very liberatory, there is something about ideas. You see, the domination of ideas is not very obvious. You have to look at something behind them. You have to scratch the surface a little more to be able to say with confidence that, maybe anarchism is an option. Many people, until one unpacks what is wrong with Marxism, many people think that, one is just being unfair when one says that, Marxism is as oppressive at the level of thought epistemologically as liberalism. So I would hold my opinion on anarchism, but I do have something to say about time and anthropology. Maybe work backwards. Now, when I said that, there is this idea of progress, the supposition that societies move through a unilinear pattern, wherein they move through successive stages. One of the key ideas that make that idea, of progress function is the notion of modern time. Now, the notion of modern time, so time can be thought of in many ways. We can begin from the level of historical time. Now, what do I mean by historical time? Now, there is a certain assumed historical time that styles itself as universal. So we think of all societies as having had their ancient period, for instance. We think of all societies as having had their medieval period, for instance, having had their modern period. And, if you like, now in the most postmodern period. We think this is a universal historical time. We think that there must be something called ancient history of Africa. We think there must be something called, medieval history of Africa. If you don't call it medieval, this is called the Middle Ages, and then the modern period. Now, this is not universal. This is abstracted from the history of Europe. It is Europe that had its ancient period, and it knows what are the characteristics of its ancient period. It is Europe that then moved from the ancient period to the medieval period, and from the medieval period into the modern period. Now, why is it important that we must know that this is not universal? It is because Europe's movement from the ancient to the medieval, from the medieval to the modern period, was driven by internal struggles and, contestations. Now, when you then take that to other societies, you say they must move through the same time periods, but what you rob them are the internal contradictions, because society's movement forward is driven by internal contradictions. So what do you then do at that point? You don't bother to say, what were the internal contradictions in Africa at this time? You just say, this was their ancient period, and then they moved to the modern period. We know that in Europe, the transition from the medieval period to the modern period was as a result of the fight between the nobility and, the divine rulers. It was, in oversimplifying, it was a class struggle of some sort, between different categories in society. One category saying, no, we're tired of, this class dominating society and imposing its ideas. Now, what do you then do when you say this is universal? You've robbed us of our own history, because what you haven't done is to say, let's go and peer through the curtain. What were the contradictions? What were the key, segments of society in Africa around this time? And we may find a completely different configuration of society. So you had this idea of time. And when anthropologists came to study the continent, they said, because we did not exist within this time, we existed outside of humanity. And so what anthropology did well, and there's an important anthropological study, that is worth mentioning here. I think it's an American anthropologist. What anthropologists did is that, remember, anthropology is a study of primitive society. Now, here was the quandary for anthropology. Anthropology is a fairly recent discipline, as recent as, the 1900s, the late 1800s, early 1900s. But it's a study of primitive society. And so first it said, okay, maybe primitive societies, because Europe has industrialized, primitive societies no longer exist in Europe. So there was an exodus of anthropologists going to everywhere else outside of Europe. But I'm concerned with them coming, into Africa. So they came and said, this is where we find primitive societies. But the problem was, you are an anthropologist in South Africa, hypothetically in 1920. It's 1920 in South Africa. It's also 1920 in America. Now, if you are going to say this is a primitive society, it means it can't exist in the same time with American society or European society. You have to remove this primitive society from the time of the modern. Because if America in 1920 is modern or Europe is modern, and we are studying a society in South Africa in 1920, and it's not existing at the same time with Europe, you have to remove it in time. They can't exist in the same time, if that makes sense. So what anthropology did was basically to use time to create the other. That's why the title of the book was, the title can...
Is it Time and the Other by Johannes Fabian?
Yes, Johannes Fabian. The Time and the Other, how anthropology makes its other.
How it makes its object.
How anthropology makes its object. So what anthropology then had to resort to was the notion of time, in order to say, well, these ones don't exist in the same time that we exist in. So they kicked us out, of European time, and said, but they did not say they were kicking us out of European time. They said they were kicking us out of time because European time had been presented as universal. And so the problem with modern time is that in it, there is an inherent hierarchy that is built into it. So when you talk about time, again, I need to remind you that I spoke about the historical time of those different time periods, but there is also, the time of the clock, which is a subject for another day. But the point is that time became an ethical value. Time became an ethical value. If you were a modern person, that meant that you had a certain outlook and ethical values, So the valuation of your life was different from the valuation of someone's life who was not modern. And so time became an ethical value, became a standard with which to put people, in unequal scales, so to say. And so this is what anthropology uses time for, in order to continue to speak about us as pre-modern people. It continues to do so today when it speaks about African people, speaks about me and you who are present, co-present here and now, but it wants to put me in a different category as being, primitive or pre-modern. And in order to justify that, it has to turn to time as an ethical value. This was the business of anthropology everywhere.
Thank you for breaking that down, as you do with everything, so elegantly. So this last question, it starts with a quick story. And I was teaching a political science course on comparative government when probably about 7 years ago, when I first got my master's. And the first day of class, this was a community college course, so I was not able to pick the textbook, and it was a state kind of pick textbook. And I had a student from Sudan in the class, and the student said, there's no mention, the only genocide mentioned in here is the Holocaust, and there's no mention of the Hiroro and Nama, and there's not even mention of the Native Americans in North America or South America, the indigenous there. And I had never heard of the Hiroro and Nama massacre, and I had a master's degree, so I had a colonial education, as you could say. And at this point, I had to, we all sat in the class and we changed the syllabus that day. And I went and I took the time to unlearn the political science I was taught. And we went through and added this to the course, and it was extremely beneficial to the students and myself. I brought it up to the department and they really just ignored it. But this was a good learning opportunity. And it really reminded me of what you talk about, of the margins of political science. And also Cedric Robinson had written about this. And I have recently just watched Exterminate All the Brutes by Raoul Peck. And he says in there that we suppress genocide, that we don't want to remember it. And, quote, we would prefer for genocide to have begun and ended with Nazism. This would indeed be most comforting. And I found this point really powerful, and also linked to put this into context of one of your lectures that was taken out of context. A very powerful point you said, that we must see the Holocaust in exactly the same light as we see the massacre of the Hiroro people. I was wondering if you could talk about pushing against the margins of political science and the politics of memory, and the work you do to fight against history, forgetting experiences, and preventing them from negation.
I mean, as you may well know, I also teach political science here at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So the University of Cape Town is one of the white, very racist institutions, in South Africa. And, Black people in South Africa constitute almost 86% of the population. But at the University of Cape Town, in terms of the student numbers, they still constitute only about 30%. So generality of the population, they constitute 86%, but in this university, they constitute only 30%, of the student population. So it's a university that is not only white in terms of the student, composition. It's also a university that has been at the forefront of peddling colonial thought. So, all the leading anthropologists, for instance, in the world, have had their stint at the University of Cape Town, whether it's Ratief Brown, whether it's Ian Shapira, all of them, have had their time at the University of Cape Town, because this is where you had, a very strong institute of, Bantu studies, as they were called, which would be Institute of African Studies later on. So this is a university that has a long history of colonial thought. Now, it is not a long history of colonial thought that is imported. It is a long history of colonial thought that also now is auto-generated, within the university itself. And so the university preserves that kind of knowledge, with all its energy and with all, its human resources. So I teach a course in politics called the Introduction to Political Science. And one of the things that would baffle any student of political science, is that, especially in Africa, is that if you look at how we are taught about the history of the discipline, there is an emphasis on the different approaches, how, for instance, the institutional approach came to be supplanted by the behavioral approach and so on and so forth. And over time, I looked at this, how the discipline is taught, and I thought that there has to be something wrong with this discipline. And over and above all the other problems of Western knowledge posing itself as universal, thinking of itself as transcultural, thinking of itself as being valid across time, all those problems, they tend to be generic, But I thought that there were very specific problems with the discipline of political science, which is basically the same, problems that your Sudanese student pointed, to you. And what was the problem as I recognized it and as I made the point? It is that if you take any classical text, Introduction to Political Science, whether it is Vernon van Dijk, whether it is Robert Dahl, or, all those known authorities in the field of political science, when they speak about the institutional approach, which was dominant in the 1920s, all of them, whether it's Epstein or whoever, all of them say or underline the fact that its downfall was the fact that it was unable to preempt the fact that institutions on their own are not enough in order to secure democracy. And they say that the clearest example of the failure of the institutional approach was its inability to see, the Holocaust in Germany, to preempt, the Holocaust in Germany, preempt it in two senses. Tell us that it might happen, but also the institutions themselves preventing it from happening, in securing democracy. And so because it failed to preempt it in those two respects, it was delegitimized within the discipline. And I began to think, the Holocaust happened between 1939 and 1945 during the Second World War. Hadn't there been other genocides that had happened since the institutional approach became the dominant approach within the study of politics? And of course, it didn't take one to be a student of history to know that there had been other genocides. Now, there had been other genocides even prior to the institutional approach, but also even at the time when the institutional approach was the dominant approach. And two examples will make the point. In Congo, which is today DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, at the time when it was Congo Free State, it was considered a personal property of the Belgian King, Leopold. And at the time, this is 1880s up until 1908. At the time when it was considered a personal fiefdom, 10 million Congolese people were killed for different reasons, but very arbitrary. If they refused to submit to the king, or if they refused to avail their labor to go and work in the rubber plantations for very arbitrary reasons, their arms would be chopped. 10 million people perished 1904 to 1908. Now, the institutional approach is not yet, fully established, but, political science is coming into its own, especially in America, at that time. The Herero Nama people in Namibia had been decimated by the German colonizers. In 1921, in South Africa, there had been a group of people called, a religious group of people called the Israelites, led by Enoch Mgijima, a group that was based in a part of South Africa called the Eastern Cape. And these people had been decimated by the white settler regime in South Africa in 1921. Now, here is the irony of the Israelites. It is that this was a religious group that called itself by the name Israelites. But even that gesture of them calling themselves the Israelites was not enough for them to evoke the sympathy of the Jews somewhere so that the Jews remember their own massacre. So when the Jews today say that the Holocaust, they do not remember that there may have been people who actually called themselves Israelites, who we must also remember were killed. But that's a separate point. The point I'm making is that the institutional approach was not moved by all these other massacres, by all these other genocides. It is only when Hitler decides to kill the Jews that the institutional approach or political science is moved. Now, this is not just the scene of political science, it is the scene of modern disciplinary knowledge, which is that modern Western disciplinary knowledge always proceeds from the sensibilities of white people. When it is other people who suffer injustice, modern Western disciplinary knowledge has no language for those other people. Even the concept genocide, by the way, I hope you would know, that gets encoded into international law only after the Jews have been killed. Prior to that, it was not part of international law. It was not a crime against, it was not a crime as it is today, in international law. It only becomes a crime when Hitler kills 6 million Jews, whereas 10 million people have been killed. But this is my point. It is not the numbers that matter. It is that human life must be valued equally, and thought must develop a capability of encountering all forms of life, whether they are black or white. It must encounter all those forms of life as being equally worthy. There must be no forms of life that are considered less important. Now, in order to address that, and here one has to make the point, to address that, you don't have to just bring all the other genocides into the record. No, something else has to change. It is how in modern thought some other people are considered human and others considered less than human. How to other people you give norms of human difference and you withhold those certain norms to other people. Because the problem is that modern Western thought, including Western history, is it only is a record of history of those who are considered human, and how the other people enter that history only at the moment when they encounter the human being. So it's how the human beings encounter the non-human. That's how we are brought into history. So the whole template will have to change of modern Western thought in order for that thought to be able to view those other forms, of crime as equally, worthy of consideration. Now, this is the problem with the ideology of memorialization. Now, when you memorialize, again, what you don't tamper with is the architecture of memorializing or the architecture of that thought on memorializing. Because if you say, let's also memorialize, the Israelites in South Africa, the Herero Nama people in Namibia, the Congolese people, What you miss is this simple fact. Let me demonstrate it. In South Africa today, by the way, post the Second World War, when Jews left Europe, they went to 3 places in large numbers. They came to South Africa, they went to America, and then they went to the present state of Israel. Now let's leave the state of Israel for a moment. Let's look at America and South Africa. When Jews settled in these 2 societies in large numbers, what did they do? They remembered once more that they were white. They rewrote the script and said there was something wrong with that obscene human being called Hitler. By the way, we are white, just like all of you. And so we will engage with you in the same project of colonial domination and decimation of Black people. When they got to South Africa, they joined other white people to oppress us as Black people, to negate us, to negate our humanity. Now, these are people who had suffered the Holocaust, but barely a month after they escaped the Holocaust, they remember suddenly that they are white, that it is correct to do unto Black people what Hitler had done to them. And they considered it wrong when Hitler did it to them. So it will not be to memorialize that will be needed to address that. What enables that? It is not human cruelty, no. It is a certain kind of thought that says there is treatment that is fit for these other people that is not fit for us. It was just a misnomer what happened there. These are the people, the Black people that Hitler should have put in the gas chambers, not us. Now we have to go back to the source. If the Jews get to America and they join the white supremacist gang in dominating the slaves and the indigenous Americans, and they get to South Africa and they do the same, and they decimate in large numbers, Black people, what is it that enables them to forget that just yesterday we also were faced with this same treatment and we said it was unjust? And the world said never again. But now the never again seems not to be applicable in this instance. I want to suggest to you that the answer will not be in the individual predilections of those Jewish people who went to America and came to South Africa. The problem has to be traced back to its original resource, which is the beginning of Western thought and particularly modern race science. That constitution of white people as fully human and the constitution of Black people as less than human. That supposition that there is treatment that is fit for human beings and that is fit for the less than human, which is us, the Black colonized.
Thank you for explaining that, Dr. Lushaba. And as you had said, the comparative politics is a form of laboratory for political science.
Yes.
And what this a similar comparative I see is with Ireland, who was colonized by England, and then many of the Irish came over to the U.S. and they were treated horribly, but then they were able to, as you say, go into this white supremacist structure and become oppressors as well once they assimilated into whiteness quite easily.
Precisely. Now, Chris, thank you so very much.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Time Talks podcast, part of the Channel Zero Network. Please support Dr. Lushaba's work, linked in the show notes. Thank you to Awareness for the music. Please rate the show, share the show, and support on Patreon if you are able. And check out some other podcasts on the Channel Zero Network.